You've read the books, done the journaling, sat through the therapy sessions, and consumed enough self-help content to fill a library. And still, somehow, you keep ending up in the same arguments, the same dynamics, and the same emotional wreckage you swore you'd never revisit again. What makes this even more unsettling is that you're not naive. You can name your attachment style, identify a trauma response in real time, and articulate exactly why you tend to self-sabotage before anyone else even notices it's happening.
And you see here, and it's all about this right here, which is why I'm so successful now.
And yet, the argument still escalates. The door still slams. The same person who hurt you 6 months ago is somehow back in your life, and you're not entirely sure how that happened. This video is about the one thing most self-help content doesn't want to admit. Knowing what's wrong with you is simply not the same as fixing it. And for many people, it was never going to be enough on its own. For a significant number of deeply reflective, growth-oriented people, self-awareness without the right framework doesn't reduce toxic behavior at all. It just makes them more articulate about it while it's actively happening.
You are doing this on purpose. I recognize I'm currently exhibiting avoidant tendencies in response to perceived emotional threat.
You've probably met this person. Maybe you are this person. Someone who can diagnose their abandonment wound mid-argument, narrate their own trigger response with clinical precision, and then go right back to shutting their partner out anyway. That gap between knowing and actually changing has a name, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why it exists, what keeps it open, and what it genuinely takes to close it for good. But before we get there, we need to sit with something uncomfortable. Why so many intelligent, reflective, growth-oriented people are completely blind to the patterns that are quietly dismantling their closest relationships. The blind spot effect is a well-documented psychological phenomenon in which the very belief that you are self-aware makes you statistically less likely to notice your own biases and behavioral patterns when they're actively playing out. Studies in cognitive psychology consistently show that people who rate themselves as highly self-aware are often the least accurate at predicting their own behavior once genuine emotional stress enters the situation.
High self-awareness rating. Accuracy under stress. The overconfidence gap.
This isn't a character flaw. It's a structural feature of how the human brain constructs and maintains self-image. And understanding it is the first meaningful step toward actually doing something about it. Think about how a visual blind spot works. It isn't a dark patch in your field of vision. It's a gap your brain fills in automatically, so smoothly and so completely that you never notice the hole is even there. Your psychological blind spots work exactly the same way. Your mind builds a story about who you are that feels entirely accurate, even when it's quietly leaving out entire chapters of your actual behavior. The person who gossips constantly but frames it as just being honest. The partner who controls through withdrawal but describes it as needing space to process. The friend who tests loyalty repeatedly but calls it protecting themselves from disappointment. All of them believe their own story completely. Self-awareness doesn't automatically cut through that story. In many cases, it simply gives the story a more convincing narrator and a more sophisticated vocabulary of reasons why the behavior is justified. And to understand where that story came from, why it's so convincing, and why it's so resistant to revision, we need to go back further than most people are comfortable going. Most of the relational patterns you carry into your adult relationships were not chosen, reasoned through, or consciously adopted. They were downloaded automatically from the environment and the people you grew up around. Emotional inheritance is the largely invisible process through which children absorb the relational blueprints of their caregivers, not because they decide to, but because those blueprints were the only working model of love and connection they ever had access to. If love in your home was conditional, withdrawn as punishment, or expressed primarily through conflict and emotional intensity, your nervous system cataloged all of that as normal, as the default baseline for what relationships feel like. Normal doesn't mean healthy, it just means familiar. And your brain is wired to move toward what's familiar, because familiarity signals safety. even when the familiar thing is the very thing that has been causing you harm. This is the neurological explanation for why intelligent, self-aware adults repeatedly choose emotionally unavailable partners, recreate chaotic dynamics, or become deeply uncomfortable the moment a relationship actually starts to feel stable and calm. Not because they don't know better, they often know better than anyone else in the room, but because unavailable and chaotic feel like home on a nervous system level, and safe and consistent feel like something is missing.
I can't believe you said that. Well, you know it's true. No, it isn't. It definitely is.
And here is where self-awareness becomes genuinely dangerous. When you can identify your inherited patterns intellectually, but your nervous system hasn't experienced anything different, you develop the haunting ability to narrate your own self-destruction in real time and keep going anyway. Which brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable truth in behavioral psychology, and the reason that changing what you do is so much harder than changing what you understand. There is a fundamental and consistently underestimated difference between intellectual understanding and embodied behavioral change, and confusing the two is the single most common reason that self-aware people remain stuck in patterns they have already fully identified. Intellectual understanding lives in your prefrontal cortex, the rational, language-based, reflective part of your brain that reads books, follows this kind of content, takes notes in therapy, and builds elegant frameworks for understanding human behavior. But toxic relational patterns don't live there. They live in the limbic system, the older, faster, emotionally reactive brain that fires in milliseconds and has absolutely no interest in your journaling practice or your self-awareness score. When your partner raises their voice, or goes suddenly quiet, or begins to pull away, it isn't your rational brain that responds first. It's the part of you that is 4 years old and frightened, and it has already made a decision before your prefrontal cortex has formed a single coherent thought. This is why you can walk into a difficult conversation with complete clarity about what you intend to do. Stay calm, listen without defending, not make it personal, and still watch yourself escalate or shut down entirely as if you had never had a single insight in your life. Knowing the pattern is a map, but a map does not move your legs. You still have to walk the actual territory through actual discomfort in actual real time. And that part will never, ever happen inside your head. So if thinking your way out doesn't work, and the evidence strongly suggests it doesn't, what does? The answer is less elegant and considerably more humbling than most people expect. One of the most overlooked reasons that toxic patterns persist in even the most self-aware people is that those patterns have, over time, become quietly fused with their sense of who they are. When you spend years explaining your anxiety, developing language for your attachment style, and articulating your coping mechanisms, those things stop being behaviors you engage in and start becoming things you simply are. I'm just an anxious person. I have abandonment issues, it's how I'm wired. That's just how I respond when I feel threatened. These phrases feel exactly like self-awareness, but they function almost identically to permission slips. There is a critical and often invisible line between understanding why you behave the way you do, which is genuinely valuable, and using that understanding as a sophisticated justification for why you don't need to behave any differently. The identity trap is seductive precisely because it wraps avoidance in the language of self-knowledge, making it nearly impossible to tell from the inside whether you're practicing genuine insight or practicing well-articulated resistance to change. This is how someone can spend 5 years in therapy and emerge with extraordinary self-understanding and almost no behavioral change, because they were building a more eloquent story about themselves rather than doing the harder work of revising it. Breaking the identity trap doesn't require denying your history or minimizing your wounds. It requires making one essential decision: that your past is an explanation for who you became, not a permanent prescription for who you are required to remain. And once you can see how identity has been quietly holding the loop in place, you're finally ready to talk about what actually interrupts it. And it is not another insight. The real work of breaking a toxic behavioral pattern doesn't happen through more insight, more content, or more sophisticated self-analysis. It happens through repetition, discomfort, and the deliberate practice of doing the opposite of what feels instinctive. In behavioral neuroscience, the mechanism for this is called response inhibition. But here is what most self-help content consistently underestimates. That pause does not appear on its own just because you understand why you're triggered. It has to be built deliberately, practiced repeatedly, and most critically, practiced inside real emotional situations, not imagined ones. That means staying in the uncomfortable conversation when every instinct is pushing you toward the door. It means tolerating the silence without sending the text designed to force a response. It means letting someone be disappointed in you without immediately performing your way back into their approval. Every single time you respond differently than your pattern, even imperfectly, even while your nervous system is flooding you with urgency, you are physically creating a new neural pathway that did not exist before that moment. Change at the behavioral level is not a breakthrough. It is not a revelation. It is not the moment something finally clicks. It is the 10,000th small act of choosing differently, most of them unglamorous, none of them trending on social media. And when those small acts begin to compound over time, something genuinely shifts, not just in your relationships, but in the story you tell yourself about who you actually are. The blind spot effect is not a personal failing. It is a predictable feature of how the human brain maintains a coherent self-image. And the most reflective, growth-oriented people among us are not immune to it. In many cases, they are more quietly captured by it, because the language of self-awareness can be borrowed just as easily to maintain a pattern as it can to dismantle one. Real growth doesn't begin the moment you understand your toxic patterns. It begins the moment you stop using that understanding as a reason to stay comfortable and start using it as a mandate to act differently, even when it's awkward and even when it doesn't feel authentic yet. The gap between who you know yourself to be and how you actually show up in your hardest, most triggered moments, that is not a failure of character. That gap is the territory, and the only direction through it is forward, one uncomfortable repetition at a time. You don't need one more framework for understanding your childhood. You need one more decision, made today, in this moment, to respond differently than you did last time. Self-awareness was always meant to be the beginning of the work. Somewhere along the way, for a lot of people, it quietly became a substitute for it. If this video challenged something you've been sitting with, drop it in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now so you never miss our videos.